Most people spend their lives trying to control their emotions, believing that mastering the reaction is the key. They attempt to calm anger after it flares, push fear aside once it arises, or manage frustration only after it takes hold. Yet true mastery does not come from reacting differently. It comes from redesigning the inner system itself. When the mind is anchored in reason and self-discipline, chaos can rage around you without ever reaching the core of your being. Strength from this kind of control is quiet, deliberate, and deeply freeing. Every insult, every provocation, every challenge becomes less about what happens outside and more about how you hold yourself within. The Stoics called this inner fortress the only true sanctuary, a place untouched by circumstance. By cultivating this resilience, by learning to observe without being pulled in, you navigate life with clarity and purpose. You no longer surrender your energy to forces beyond your control. Calm, steady, and unseen, this strength moves with you, shaping presence without needing to assert itself. The practice begins with noticing the spark before it ignites. A dismissive word, a fleeting glance, a sudden gesture can flare into tension if left unchecked. But the mind trained to observe creates a space between stimulus and response. Even a brief pause allows freedom, a moment to choose rather than react, to step out of the river and stand on the shore, deciding your own direction. This pause is not avoidance, it is presence. A conscious assertion of sovereignty over the inner world, where clarity guides thought and intentionality guides action. Most people live in reaction, often unaware of the spark that sets off their inner turmoil. A word, a glance, a subtle gesture. Suddenly the mind ignites, thoughts racing, the body tense, the heart quickened. This is not our natural state. It emerges from unexamined habit, from allowing the automatic machinery of the mind to run unchecked. Stoic thinkers long ago noted that it is not the events themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. Every surge of anger or irritation arrives because something has struck unfiltered. Yet the mind, trained to observe, can create a space between what happens outside and how it responds inside. Even the briefest pause carries freedom. It is the difference between being carried downstream and standing on the shore, choosing the direction of your own current. This pause is not avoidance, it is presence, a conscious assertion of sovereignty over the inner world. When the mind pauses, clarity enters. The insult loses its sting, provocation loses momentum, tension dissolves into observation. You are no longer subject to circumstance, you participate with agency. In that pause, subtle intentions become visible. The emotions behind words and gestures reveal themselves. Habitual patterns of response, the triggers that once shifted calm to agitation, are laid bare. Observing these patterns, the mind steps back, notices the rhythm of events, and can choose an alternative approach. True power does not control the world outside, it arises from mastery within. When others attempt to provoke, they find no reaction, no leverage, no satisfaction. This absence of response is not passivity, it is discipline. Its influence runs deeper than any overt display of dominance. Practicing this pause requires gentle awareness and repeated attention. Early attempts may feel brief or imperceptible, yet each instant strengthens a muscle of restraint. By naming the rising tension, by noting the impulse without surrendering to it, the mind gradually enlarges the gap between stimulus and reaction. Each pause becomes an assertion of agency, a subtle rebellion against the habitual chains of the unexamined self. The world rewards immediacy, yet true mastery lies in measured engagement. Those who can inhabit this space navigate interactions with calm that unsettles the predictable. Relationships change, not because others behave differently, but because responses shift. Conflicts lose automatic intensity. Decisions clouded by agitation gain clarity. Power emerges naturally from presence rather than force, creating influence that is quiet yet profound, visible in how the individual moves through the world without surrendering internal stability. Over time, this practice transforms perception and interaction. Words that once carried the power to wound now pass like leaves floating across a stream. Emotional energy that once dictated thought is observed instead of absorbed. The mind, no longer enslaved to automatic reaction, becomes a space of deliberate choice. Even repeated provocation cannot penetrate a fortified internal landscape. Each interaction becomes a test and reinforcement of discipline, a demonstration of agency in action. Presence itself becomes a subtle tool of influence. Others sense the composure, the steadiness, the quiet authority. Attempts to manipulate or provoke lose potency. The individual who consistently exercises this discipline moves with clarity, makes decisions from reflection, and shapes the world around them by first mastering the world within. If you wish to continue sharpening your mind and deepening this practice, subscribing is more than a click. It is a deliberate step toward cultivating awareness, self-mastery, and presence. You choose to engage with ideas that expand understanding and strengthen the inner foundation from which all action flows. It is a quiet, thoughtful act, aligned with the pursuit of clarity and unshakable freedom, a commitment to observing the world without being swept away by it. Ultimately, the cultivation of a brief pause between stimulus and reaction is a profound act of self-ownership. It aligns thought, perception, and emotion with intentionality, creating a mind capable of navigating complexity without being overwhelmed. The Stoics remind us that the obstacle is often the path, and in this case, the challenge of habitual reaction becomes the opportunity for mastery. Each deliberate pause, each instance of observation without immediate engagement, reinforces the architecture of a mind that is free, steady, and responsive on its own terms. In this way, those who once found themselves controlled by the actions of others become architects of their own internal state, unshakable in the presence of chaos and capable of responding with clarity, discernment, and deliberate influence. By consistently practicing this approach, the transformation becomes not only evident internally, but visible externally. Others may sense an unhurried calm, a reflective presence, an ability to listen and respond without haste. These qualities, cultivated through repeated attention and measured engagement, shift the balance of interactions, creating an environment where impulsive attempts at manipulation or provocation fail. Power no longer derives from immediate reactions, but from the sustained application of thoughtful observation. Through this practice, one embodies a form of psychological presence that commands influence without exerting force, cultivates respect without confrontation, and achieves a freedom that is both personal and relational. This is not an exercise in detachment or suppression, but in precise engagement. It is the deliberate shaping of one's mental environment to align perception, judgment, and action with reason and intentionality. By training the mind to insert a pause between stimulus and reaction, one reshapes the habitual flow of thought, diminishes the hold of provocation, and creates a foundation for consistent, measured, and strategic interaction. The practice builds an inner architecture that is resilient to external fluctuations, enabling clarity of thought, freedom of action, and the cultivation of an inner life that is unshakable, coherent, and deeply influential. Most of our lives are spent believing that what happens to us defines how we feel. Every insult, every interruption, every perceived slight becomes an invitation to react, and too often the reaction comes before we even recognize the trigger. The mind, untrained, automatically assumes it is the center of events, the intended target of every word and action. Stoicism reminds us that the world offers events, not meanings, and the interpretation is entirely ours. By stepping back, even slightly, the patterns of behavior around us begin to reveal themselves. The harsh word is not a condemnation, but a signal. The dismissive glance is not an attack, but a clue to the intentions behind it. When viewed from this distance, the chaos of social interaction becomes intelligible, less threatening, and increasingly manageable. This is not detachment in the sense of indifference. It is a deliberate reorientation, a conscious choice to observe rather than absorb, to witness rather than be wounded. The power of observation lies in its ability to transform input into insight. What once felt personal and intrusive becomes information. Disrespect is no longer a sharp jab, but a demonstration of intent and pattern. Anger that arises in another person is energy to analyze, not energy to mirror. When the mind cultivates this perspective, reaction slow and clarity emerges. The initial impulse to respond diminishes, replaced by a calm assessment. You begin to notice the subtle shifts that precede conflict. The tone of voice that signals impatience, the gesture that hints at irritation, the rhythm of interaction that suggests an agenda. By attending to these signals with curiosity instead of defensiveness, you transform encounters from battles into opportunities for understanding. You see not a personal assault, but a map of human behavior. In this space, you are no longer a reactive participant. You become a deliberate observer, capable of influencing outcomes through calm presence rather than visible force. Learning to operate from this elevated perspective requires practice, because the mind naturally resists surrendering automatic interpretations. Early attempts may feel forced or unnatural. The habitual sense of being under attack is deeply ingrained, and the impulses to defend, justify, or retaliate surface quickly. Yet each moment in which you pause, observe, and choose your response rather than react to the stimulus builds strength. By separating yourself from the narrative of provocation, you reclaim autonomy. You decide which events demand energy and which are irrelevant to your trajectory. This discipline transforms emotional labor into a resource you control rather than a cost imposed by circumstance. Over time, as the practice deepens, you notice the subtle freedom in not being manipulated by the judgments of others, the unspoken advantage of being unpredictable, not through deception, but through measured engagement. The structural shield that emerges from this practice is both protective and enabling. Calm is no longer a performance to hide vulnerability. It is the natural state of a mind trained in observation and discernment. You encounter the world with the awareness that provocation is a choice by others, not a compulsion for you. Interpersonal friction, which previously triggered automatic agitation, now becomes a field for analysis. You register intent, decode patterns, and determine your course with deliberate precision. The energy that once fueled reactive cycles is now available for strategic application, for deliberate expression, for careful intervention, or for conscious withdrawal. This is not about suppressing emotion, but about governing it with insight, ensuring that responses are aligned with reason rather than habit. By observing without participating in the emotional transfer, you retain sovereignty over your internal environment while navigating external dynamics with skill. The subtleties of human interaction become more intelligible from this vantage point. In observing without immediate engagement, you detect repetition, strategy, and unconscious impulses in those around you. One learns to distinguish between genuine concern, calculated manipulation, and habitual irritability. The clarity afforded by this perspective allows action that is neither reactive nor performative. One responds when response is warranted, remains silent when it is strategic, and disengages when neither engagement nor reaction serves purpose. Each choice is intentional, each gesture measured, each word deliberate. This discipline cultivates a form of influence that does not rely on force or intimidation, but on consistent presence, composure, and insight. Others come to recognize that attempts to provoke yield nothing and eventually cease, not out of fear, but out of the natural futility of expecting leverage where none exists. This practice cultivates both freedom and depth. When the internal state is no longer determined by external provocations, one experiences a clarity that permits reflection, understanding, and deliberate action. Encounters previously experienced as threats become sources of insight. Anger and criticism transform from burdens into information, guiding perception and refining judgment. As Seneca observed, "He is most powerful who has power over himself." By consistently observing rather than absorbing, one builds a mental resilience that is both defensive and empowering. This resilience is not rigid. It is flexible, responsive, and deeply anchored in reason. The mind can engage fully when required and withdraw strategically when appropriate. This dual capability of engagement and detachment creates a presence that is difficult to unsettle, resistant to manipulation, and capable of influencing outcomes through calm authority. The long-term effect of maintaining this perspective is profound. Patterns of interaction shift subtly but decisively. Those who once sought to provoke or unsettle recognize the futility of exerting influence. The individual's internal discipline radiates outward, shaping dynamics without overt assertion. Influence becomes a product of clarity, measured engagement, and the absence of unnecessary reaction. The mind, no longer enslaved by perceived personal assaults, navigates relationships and environments with deliberate agency. Emotional energy is no longer spent defending or retaliating, but applied in alignment with intention and understanding. The structural shield of observation without absorption becomes a defining characteristic, offering freedom, insight, and a form of influence rooted in calm mastery rather than coercion. Ultimately, removing oneself from the target of emotional triggers is a profound exercise in self-governance. By observing rather than absorbing, analyzing rather than reacting, and responding with deliberate intention, the mind reclaims sovereignty over its own terrain. Each insult, slight, or provocation becomes a source of information rather than a source of turmoil. Through consistent practice, observation becomes second nature, emotional energy becomes a tool, and the individual moves through life with a presence that is steady, clear, and deeply influential. This is not a defense against the world, but a cultivation of inner freedom, a conscious practice of discipline, and an embodiment of a mind that navigates external events without losing its own center. By consistently practicing detachment from personal offense while maintaining awareness, one develops a depth of psychological presence that is both subtle and unmistakable. Relationships evolve, conflicts are managed with precision, and the individual's capacity to operate strategically in complex social environments increases. Emotional sovereignty is no longer theoretical. It manifests in behavior, interaction, and the perception of others. The repeated practice of observation without absorption cultivates insight, clarity, and influence that emerge naturally from a mind anchored in discipline. Through this approach, the individual achieves a form of freedom that is simultaneously internal and relational, a steady presence in the midst of flux, and a measured influence that is neither imposed nor aggressive, but profoundly effective. At first, the practice may feel unnatural. The instinctive mind seeks coherence, a singular emotional truth that aligns with perception. Yet the reality of social dynamics and human behavior is far more complex. People rarely communicate in a single tone or reveal a consistent pattern, and a mind limited to one state is ill-prepared to navigate this complexity. By training yourself to be simultaneously calm and alert, relaxed and acutely aware, detached yet fully present, you occupy a space that others cannot fully comprehend. Their attempts to predict your reactions are met with partial understanding, false assumptions, and miscalculations. This layering of states acts as armor, protecting the inner self from manipulation, misjudgment, and interference. It is not a performance. It is a structural quality of attention and perception that allows engagement without exposure, participation without surrender, and observation without reactivity. Holding these layers requires conscious effort and repetition. Each interaction presents an opportunity to reinforce the capacity for simultaneous states. A conversation may appear casual, yet the mind can track subtle cues beneath the surface. The choice of words, the cadence of voice, the rhythm of pauses, and the pattern of gestures. By maintaining a relaxed exterior while scanning these cues, the individual accrues insight without giving away emotional energy. The apparent calm provides reassurance and accessibility, encouraging dialogue, while the internal attention maps meaning, context, and strategy with clarity. This dual presence fosters influence that is subtle yet profound. It is not forceful but undeniable, creating an environment where others operate with awareness of your presence but without certainty of your intentions or limits. Complexity cultivated in this way is not mere intellectual exercise. It becomes a functional tool of psychological influence. When someone engages with a person who operates in multiple simultaneous states, their assumptions are constantly challenged. They anticipate a reaction that does not arrive, predict a response that does not align with expectation, and attempt to manipulate dynamics that are structurally resistant to their influence. This unpredictability is not chaos. It is intentional, refined through awareness and discipline. Each interaction reinforces the capacity to be present while maintaining inner distance, accessible without being vulnerable, responsive without being readable. The mind becomes a space where influence and observation coexist, where participation and detachment intersect, and where control over one's own state is complete without the need to dominate externally. The Stoic analogy of water is apt here. Just as water flows, adjusts, and conforms to the contours of its container while maintaining cohesion and integrity, a mind trained in internal contradiction remains adaptable, resilient, and coherent. It does not fracture under pressure, nor does it yield to provocation. Emotional energy is neither squandered nor misdirected. It is measured, applied with intention, and conserved as a resource. In holding multiple states simultaneously, the individual develops the capacity to navigate uncertainty with poise, observe without being observed, and influence without being overt. This creates a presence that is both impenetrable and fluid, structured and flexible, accessible yet unmappable. Others are left to interpret fragments, encountering only glimpses of the whole, unable to construct a complete map, and therefore unable to exercise leverage or control. Maintaining this equilibrium is not passive. It is an active discipline, a conscious alignment of attention, perception, and awareness. The mind must remain vigilant, monitoring the subtle rise of automatic responses and habitual tendencies while preserving the deliberate layering of states. Each successful exercise strengthens the architecture of presence, reinforcing the ability to engage strategically while remaining grounded internally. Over time, the practice becomes second nature, and the duality of calm observation and engaged attention coexists seamlessly. The individual moves through complex interactions without revealing the full breadth of internal processing, ensuring that responses are measured, thoughtful, and intentional rather than reactive. The influence of such a presence extends beyond immediate interactions. Patterns of expectation in social dynamics shift when the person with layered emotional states is engaged. Others may anticipate volatility or predictability, but encounter neither, causing recalibration, hesitation, or restraint. Influence emerges organically, without assertion, through the mere fact of composure, subtlety, and ungraspable depth. By consistently holding multiple states simultaneously, the individual becomes a pivot in social space, capable of shaping dynamics through observation, awareness, and carefully chosen engagement rather than through overt force. This approach ensures that the energy of interactions is directed strategically, that attention is allocated consciously, and that internal sovereignty is preserved even in the midst of complexity. The practical benefits of this skill are significant. Negotiations, conversations, and decisions become arenas in which one can operate without being ensnared by the expectations or manipulations of others. Emotional exposure is minimized not by withdrawal, but by controlled presence. Each layer of observation and calm strengthens the mind's ability to remain steady, to respond with clarity, and to exert influence subtly yet effectively. By cultivating this dual presence, the individual transcends conventional limitations, becoming a participant in interactions without yielding to reactive pressures. The mind is both shielded and empowered, able to absorb information without being consumed by it, capable of engaging without losing control, and positioned to influence without imposing. Over time, the internal contradiction becomes intuitive. The mind no longer struggles to reconcile multiple states because the discipline has embedded them in habitual processing. Calm, alertness, attentiveness, and engagement coexist naturally, producing a presence that is difficult to anticipate, challenging to manipulate, and profoundly effective in navigating social and psychological landscapes. Others perceive depth, steadiness, and unshakable focus without fully comprehending the complexity that sustains it. This is the quiet power of internal contradiction, influence without assertion, adaptability without compromise, and presence that commands respect without demanding it. Ultimately, the cultivation of layered emotional states is a practice of freedom. By mastering the ability to hold multiple internal realities simultaneously, one becomes resistant to external attempts at control, unpredictable to those who would manipulate, and anchored in a clarity that is both subtle and pervasive. Complexity becomes a shield, unpredictability a tool, and composure a form of influence. The mind that operates in this way is neither overwhelmed by circumstance nor diminished by the intentions of others. Instead, it navigates life with grace, clarity, and quiet authority, shaping outcomes through observation, discipline, and deliberate engagement, while maintaining an inner state that is steadfast, adaptable, and entirely self-directed. Through deliberate cultivation, practice, and reflection, the individual who masters this approach achieves a form of presence that is simultaneously visible and impenetrable, engaged and detached, attentive and unobtainable. Each interaction reinforces the architecture of awareness, strengthens the discipline of observation, and expands the capacity for strategic engagement. In holding multiple emotional states without fragmentation, the mind becomes a force of subtle power, able to respond with intention, influence outcomes without force, and maintain equilibrium regardless of external turbulence. This is not merely an exercise in skill, it is a transformation in how presence, attention, and influence are embodied and expressed. Every motion, every expression, every subtle shift in posture conveys information to those around us, whether we intend it or not. A smile can reveal admiration, a tightening of the jaw can betray frustration, a fleeting sparkle in the eyes can signal triumph. These small signals, often unnoticed by ourselves, serve as maps for others, allowing them to navigate the internal terrain of our minds. Each reaction becomes a doorway through which influence can pass, a path by which understanding or manipulation can occur. Most interactions, if left unchecked, operate on this silent exchange of cues. We offer up responses unconsciously, believing them to be spontaneous, natural, or harmless. Yet in doing so, we reveal patterns and vulnerabilities that others can read and exploit. By attending to the currency of reaction, one recognizes that every outward display is a choice, and that the momentary surrender of emotional energy carries consequences far beyond the immediate interaction. When the mind begins to treat reactions as deliberate, strategic expressions rather than automatic outputs, a profound shift occurs. What once might have been a hurried response to praise or a reflexive wince at criticism is now filtered through attention, insight, and purpose. The same energy that would once have been spent in fleeting validation, irritation, or triumph can now be preserved, measured, and applied when it serves an intentional goal. This is not suppression, it is governance. The Stoics emphasized that self-mastery consists of understanding what lies within our control and applying it with reason. Reactions are within our power to govern, and by mastering them, we transform the dynamic of every interaction. Those who provoke or attempt to manipulate rely upon immediate reciprocity. They seek acknowledgement, engagement, or resistance. When these are withheld, the expected feedback loop is broken and the dynamic is recalibrated on terms defined by the individual rather than by external pressures. Consciously regulating response requires awareness of both the internal impulse and its outward manifestation. Often, the first flash of emotional energy arrives before we are fully conscious of it. Anger, embarrassment, surprise, or joy can surge instantly, producing visible effects that convey information to others. By observing these initial impulses without surrendering to them, the individual creates a space of choice. In that space, one evaluates the utility of reaction, whether expressing the emotion will advance objectives, establish boundaries, convey insight, or serve no meaningful purpose. As Epictetus reminded us, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. The discipline of measured response does not eliminate emotion, but organizes it, allocating it with precision, and rendering it a tool rather than a vulnerability. The person who masters this process transforms interactions from arenas of unintentional revelation into stages for deliberate engagement, where energy is expended according to intention rather than habit. Strategic management of reaction transforms attention itself. Observers, accustomed to reading predictable cues, begin to focus on the rare moments when energy is expressed. These moments become charged, meaningful, and impactful precisely because they are chosen. The individual directs attention rather than being directed by it. This shift is subtle and often invisible to those untrained in observation, yet it reshapes the landscape of perception. Responses are no longer diluted by reflexive engagement. They are concentrated, deliberate, and consequential. Over time, the discipline of selective expression produces a state in which the mind operates with heightened clarity, the body with controlled presence, and the interaction with calibrated influence. The currency of emotional output becomes sovereign, serving the individual's intentions rather than the expectations or provocations of others. The power of such selective engagement extends beyond individual moments. By treating reactions as a tool, the individual cultivates consistency in autonomy rather than in predictability. Patterns are no longer easily anticipated. The map that others attempt to construct is incomplete. In situations of tension, negotiation, or observation, the mind remains free to act from awareness rather than compulsion. Energy is conserved for contexts in which it is strategically advantageous, enhancing effectiveness while minimizing exposure. This measured approach builds a reputation of stability and resilience, reinforcing both presence and influence. The subtle authority created through disciplined reaction fosters respect, invites engagement on chosen terms, and diminishes the leverage of those who seek to elicit immediate or automatic responses. Practicing this discipline requires continual mindfulness. Impulses arise with great speed, and habituated patterns must be consciously interrupted to reinforce mastery. Each observed moment of restraint strengthens the mind's capacity for strategic engagement. Over time, the individual internalizes the principles, allowing automatic responses to be filtered through awareness rather than habit. Emotional energy that once leaked into every interaction is now deployed deliberately, reinforcing a structure of presence that is both autonomous and influential. The practice does not eliminate humanity or responsiveness. It refines them, concentrating effect while minimizing susceptibility. The mind becomes a site of intentionality, capable of navigating complexity, conflict, and social nuance with clarity and precision. The benefits of such discipline manifest in subtle but tangible ways. Relationships evolve, not because external circumstances have changed, but because interactions are shaped by deliberate attention rather than reactive behavior. The individual engages selectively, responds with intentionality, and conveys presence without surrendering vulnerability. Influence arises organically, not through coercion, intimidation, or aggression, but through calibrated visibility and controlled energy. By transforming reactions into tools rather than leaks, one establishes both freedom and authority, creating a presence that is adaptive, ungraspable, and quietly commanding. Each interaction reinforces the structure, expanding the capacity for discernment, strategic engagement, and self-governed attention. Over time, the mind's calibration of reaction cultivates a profound resilience. External provocation, criticism, or praise loses the ability to dictate emotional state. Responses become selective, intentional, and aligned with overarching principles of presence, clarity, and strategic influence. Those who attempt to manipulate encounter resistance not in force but in absence, a quiet recalibration of expectation. By managing the flow of emotional currency, the individual develops an unassailable position in which interactions are navigated on terms defined by reasoning, observation, and conscious choice. Influence emerges without exertion, energy is deployed with purpose, and autonomy is preserved across contexts. Through repeated practice, this approach solidifies into habitual skill. Emotional responses are no longer freely given, yet the individual remains engaged, perceptive, and fully capable of participation. The economy of reaction becomes a deliberate resource, preserved, allocated, and applied in alignment with conscious intention. By mastering the flow of attention and energy, the mind attains a form of freedom and influence that is simultaneously internal and relational, shaping outcomes without the necessity of overt control and asserting presence without surrendering integrity. This is the sovereignty of the self expressed through the discipline of selective engagement. The mind has an astonishing capacity to carry burdens invisible to the eye, yet heavy in their influence. Each past insult, failure, or betrayal leaves an imprint, subtle yet persistent, shaping expectations, reactions, and the way the world is perceived. These imprints, accumulated over years, form patterns that guide behavior and color judgment, often without conscious awareness. Stoicism reminds us that by clinging to the past, we surrender control of the present. Memory is necessary for learning, yet when intertwined with resentment, fear, or regret, it can become a shackle, binding the mind to repetitions of prior wounds rather than allowing it to navigate the current moment freely. Every replayed humiliation, every lingering grievance, every unhealed slight subtly dictates choices and compromises autonomy. Those who carry these weights often find that their decisions, relationships, and energy are constrained by scripts authored long before, by events over which they have no present control. The first step toward liberation is recognition, understanding that emotional memory is not truth, but a narrative layered over facts. Insults and betrayals are events. The reactions, the stories told about them, are constructions. By distinguishing the factual data from the emotional residue, the mind begins to reclaim sovereignty. A past betrayal need not dictate distrust. It provides evidence of behavior that can inform judgment. A failure need not define capability. It offers insight into limits and opportunities for improvement. When one observes memory as a source of information rather than a source of suffering, the emotional charge diminishes naturally. The Stoics emphasized the importance of using reason to navigate the impressions of the mind. In this practice, memory transforms from a chain into a library, a place to extract lessons without becoming ensnared by the feelings attached. This separation of data from pain requires intentional engagement with the past. Emotional residues are sticky by design, often resurfacing unbidden in moments of stress or confrontation. Left unchecked, they distort perception, misinform decision-making, and create patterns of predictability that others can exploit. By consciously identifying the factual content within experiences and discarding the accompanying charge, the individual frees attention and energy for the present. Each memory, once processed and decoupled from automatic emotion, becomes a reference point rather than a lever of manipulation. When provocation arises, the mind can recall lessons without absorbing the emotional weight of prior encounters. The past informs, but does not dictate. The individual is no longer captive to old scripts, able instead to navigate situations with clarity and intentionality. This discipline is cultivated through consistent practice and reflective attention. The first instances of decoupling emotion from memory may feel effortful, as the mind instinctively attaches weight to past experiences. Yet each deliberate separation reinforces the structural integrity of presence. By observing memory with discernment, identifying actionable insights, and releasing the emotional charge, one strengthens the capacity for clarity and autonomy. The Stoics taught that the mind must be trained to resist the automatic pull of impressions, to distinguish between what is within control and what is not. Emotional memory, when properly processed, becomes a tool rather than a trap, providing guidance and wisdom without compromising agency or stability. The repeated application of this principle gradually transforms internal landscapes, reducing vulnerability to manipulation and enhancing composure under pressure. In observing without attachment, one also gains insight into the habitual tendencies of thought. Memories tied to grievance or regret often create patterns of expectation and predisposition that guide attention unconsciously. By recognizing these patterns, the individual uncovers areas where prior experiences shape behavior in ways that are no longer relevant or constructive. This awareness allows for recalibration, the deliberate adjustment of mental orientation, so that responses are determined by present realities rather than historical projections. The mind, trained in this way, navigates events with precision and presence, guided by intelligence and reflection instead of reactive habit. Emotional freedom becomes the standard condition rather than an occasional achievement, and the internal landscape is stabilized against the currents of past wounds. The capacity to extract lessons from the past without carrying its pain also amplifies strategic influence. When the mind operates free from emotional residue, perception is sharpened. Situations are assessed objectively, interactions are evaluated with clarity, and decisions are informed by insight rather than reactive impulse. In this state, the individual becomes less predictable and more resilient. Attempts to manipulate through provocation, intimidation, or exploitation are rendered ineffective because the levers that previously existed, the vulnerabilities born of emotional history, are no longer present. Presence becomes both a shield and a conduit for influence, shielded from intrusion, yet capable of navigating complexity with understanding, discernment, and authority. Consistency in this practice builds profound resilience. Emotional memory, once untangled from habitual pain, ceases to dominate internal narratives. The mind operates as a site of intelligence rather than reflexive reaction. Challenges are encountered with equanimity. Setbacks are analyzed and integrated. Successes are understood without attachment. By decoupling emotional residue from factual understanding, the individual becomes a stable point in relational and social landscapes, capable of influencing interactions without being swayed by lingering historical patterns. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." This stability is subtle yet far-reaching, manifesting in thoughtful speech, measured action, and a calm yet attentive presence. The structural integrity of the mind, reinforced through disciplined engagement with memory, ensures clarity of perception and freedom of action. The transformation extends beyond personal resilience. As emotional memory is processed and neutralized, the individual cultivates a form of psychological presence that shapes social and professional environments. The ability to observe without absorbing allows interactions to unfold without the automatic escalation of past patterns. Others are met with discernment, strategic engagement, and clarity. The lessons of history inform insight, but the past no longer dictates outcome or state. Presence becomes a vehicle for influence, a medium through which composure, strategic understanding, and deliberate attention are conveyed without overt assertion. The mind, unburdened by unresolved grievances, navigates complexity with a freedom and authority that are palpable to those around it. People naturally look for patterns in others, seeking consistency that allows prediction and understanding. The brain craves coherence. It wants to know where someone stands, what they will do next, and how they are likely to respond. These mental models are essential for social navigation, yet they are also a form of leverage. When someone is fully legible, their responses are anticipated, their intentions can be inferred, and influence can be applied predictably. Most individuals, without conscious thought, reveal themselves through repeated behaviors, verbal habits, and familiar reactions. Each interaction adds to the pattern, making them easier to read, easier to predict, and therefore more vulnerable to manipulation or control. To reclaim freedom and influence, it is necessary to interrupt this pattern, to make oneself less legible while remaining authentic. This is not deception, but a deliberate calibration of presence, a conscious layering of self that defies easy mapping. The deliberate variation of behavior requires discipline and self-awareness. It is easy to fall into familiar patterns because they are comfortable, efficient, and reinforced by habit. Yet, predictability, while convenient, is exploitable. By consciously observing the cues that others use to form expectations and then adjusting responses to disrupt those expectations, the individual exercises autonomy. One might engage enthusiastically in a conversation, revealing warmth and openness, only to shift in a different context to a measured reserve, appearing focused and professional. Each response aligns with intention, not with a need to perform a fixed identity. Over time, this practice conditions the mind to inhabit multiple authentic modes of being simultaneously, allowing engagement across a spectrum of situations while remaining ungraspable and strategically insulated. This approach also amplifies influence without aggression. When one's patterns are inconsistent yet coherent within each context, others are compelled to recalibrate continuously. Attempts to anticipate reaction, provoke response, or exploit habitual tendencies are disrupted. In professional or social environments, this creates a subtle advantage. Negotiations unfold on terms informed by strategic clarity rather than automatic predictability. Others may project expectations or assumptions only to find that the map they have constructed is incomplete. Uncertainty is no longer a limitation. It becomes leverage. The individual navigates interactions fluidly, adjusting engagement to align with objectives while remaining anchored internally. Presence is maintained without rigidity, adaptability without compromise, and influence without coercion. Underlying this practice is a deep respect for authenticity. Fragmentation is not fabrication. It is intentional emphasis. Each facet of behavior corresponds to a real capacity or disposition, expressed when context calls for it. The individual does not feign qualities or manipulate identity for superficial gain. Instead, they calibrate visibility, revealing aspects of themselves strategically while withholding unnecessary exposure. This approach balances transparency with discretion. The mind learns to judge when engagement will serve purpose and when withholding response preserves autonomy. In this balance, identity becomes both resilient and dynamic, present yet impenetrable, influencing without demanding, guiding without forcing. It is a refined architecture of presence where the internal core remains secure and external perception is shaped deliberately. The power of deliberate unpredictability lies in its psychological subtlety. Humans are wired to rely on patterns for navigation, and when those patterns fail, uncertainty is generated. By maintaining a consistent yet strategically fragmented presence, the individual creates an environment in which others cannot easily exercise influence or anticipate decisions. This creates a form of authority rooted in internal stability rather than external assertion. The mind remains free to operate according to reason and intention, while the social landscape is shaped through careful calibration of appearance and engagement. Unpredictability becomes a shield, autonomy a tool, and presence an instrument of influence that requires neither overt force nor visible domination. Practicing perceptual fragmentation strengthens adaptability. Situations vary, and rigid consistency often limits effectiveness. By learning to express different authentic facets in response to contextual demands, the individual develops resilience, responsiveness, and strategic insight. Emotional, social, and cognitive flexibility are reinforced, allowing one to navigate complexity without sacrificing stability. The mind internalizes the principle that influence is not about being fully visible, but about being selectively perceptible, revealing just enough to guide outcomes without being fully exposed. Each encounter becomes a calibration exercise, enhancing the capacity to operate freely while shaping interactions with subtle authority. The long-term effect of cultivating layered presence is profound. Patterns that previously dictated expectations now serve as frameworks for strategic adaptation rather than constraints. The individual retains coherence internally while remaining elusive externally. Others may sense depth and stability, but cannot construct a reliable model, preventing manipulation, influence, or exploitation. This dynamic fosters freedom and power simultaneously. Freedom to act with reason and clarity, power derived from the inability of others to predict or control behavior. Influence becomes emergent rather than imposed, subtle yet undeniable, and interactions unfold under conditions defined by the deliberate architecture of presence. Fragmentation also deepens insight. By observing responses to varied presentations of self, one gains knowledge of both personal tendencies and the tendencies of others. Social dynamics, emotional cues, and relational patterns become clearer when the mind experiments with differing authentic expressions. This deliberate layering allows the individual to identify the signals that carry meaning and those that are misdirection. Perception becomes a tool rather than a passive process, shaping engagement while preserving internal equilibrium. Each interaction reinforces the capacity to be observed without being fully readable, engaged without being ensnared, and influential without overt control. Ultimately, the conscious disruption of predictability allows the mind to navigate complexity with autonomy. By calibrating which aspects of identity to present, one becomes strategically unpredictable, socially resilient, and psychologically insulated. The individual engages authentically, yet in a manner that is not exhaustively comprehensible to others. Autonomy is preserved, influence is amplified, and presence is maintained under conditions of intentional ambiguity. In a world where predictability can be exploited, this deliberate variability becomes a source of freedom, a tool of resilience, and a foundation for enduring influence. The architecture of layered presence ensures that the mind operates from intention, control, and insight, rendering it untouchable in ways that are both subtle and profound. The practice of selective visibility and strategic fragmentation of self is a disciplined cultivation of influence, autonomy, and freedom. By navigating social and psychological landscapes through varying authentic expressions, one preserves internal sovereignty while shaping interactions with deliberation. The mind becomes adaptive, resilient, and strategically opaque. Patterns of expectation are disrupted, leverage is neutralized, and the individual achieves a form of freedom rooted in deliberate presence rather than external control. This is the power of perceptual fragmentation, a conscious, thoughtful, and effective approach to navigating the complexities of human behavior while remaining untouchable at the level of internal architecture. Every step toward mastery begins within, in the quiet moments when choice replaces reaction and presence replaces chaos. Freedom is not found in avoiding the world, but in claiming sovereignty over the mind that navigates it. You are the architect of your own inner world, and every deliberate pause, every measured response, every withheld reaction builds a foundation that cannot be shaken. Carry that clarity forward and let it guide the way you move, think, and influence. If you want to deepen this practice, explore one of the suggested videos on the screen now. They will guide you further into the principles of Stoic discipline and mental mastery. Thank you for being a part of Stoic Journal and for taking the time to cultivate a mind that is both unshakable and free.